Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're back for another rambling because it's all about the retro. It's all about the entertainment. It is, after all, what we do here. We bring the fun, but this time we're going to have a little bit of Schadenfreude fun. This time we are going to go back to a bit of a running theme from previous years, and that is we're going to discuss video game lawsuits, specifically ones involving Nintendo. We have seen Nintendo sue other companies. We have seen other companies sue Nintendo. Sometimes Nintendo's in the right. Sometimes they're just being buttheads. This time, though, it's our old buddies at Atari. Now, we have discussed a basic history of Atari before, and some of this is going to be stuff that we touched on and glossed over in previous videos. We're going to dig in deep this time because Atari had a subdivision that was all based around trying to skirt Nintendo policy, and in the process, they got themselves a big old lawsuit. So let's get into the background before we get into the drama. Now, by 1984, the company known as Atari Inc. had been split into two distinct companies. Atari Corporation took care of the computer and console games, as well as the hardware and the rights to the Atari brand for these domains. It was, for all intents and purposes, the company that, following this 84 split, most gamers thought of as Atari, the company that was making Atari video game systems and making Atari original games. However, there was also a company called Atari Games, which was Atari's original arcade division and who used the Atari name on arcade releases. However, because of the division, they were not able to use it on console or computer games. When Atari Games wanted to enter the console game market, licensing, arcade titles to console use, or alternatively licensing games that other companies program but they were publishing, very commonly happens, as we've touched on in many of our video game industry videos. Well, they couldn't call them Atari because we already had an Atari that was making console games. So what do? Well, they formed a new subsidiary of Atari Games called Tengen. Now, similar to how Atari took its name from the Japanese board game Go, Tengen did as well. Tengen referring to the central point of the board, little core where everything it's a thing. If you know the game Go, you get it. If you don't, hey, check out Go. It's actually a really fun game, famous internationally. Good times. Now, at the time, Nintendo, as part of a response to Atari's earlier imploding of the video game industry in America, had very strict licensing from their publishers. Specifically, Nintendo restricted their licensees to releasing only 5 games per year, mandated that Nintendo handle cartridge manufacturing, partially to ensure quality of product, partially to ensure that the numbers were where Nintendo needed them to be, so the market wasn't flooded, or these companies that were making product for Nintendo didn't spend so much money printing more cartridges than anybody else would have told them they could reasonably sell, that they hurt their finances, and the companies wouldn't be there in a year or two to make the games Nintendo needed to put on their console. Again, something that led to the Atari implosion, which makes it doubly appropriate Nintendo was putting these restrictions on a company that descended from that original Atari. You see, you get it? Yes, to some publishers, the restrictions seemed harsh, but there was a reason behind it. Nintendo knew how things had gone in the previous years for Atari and for the industry in general, because at that time, Atari basically was the home console game industry in America and did not want a repeat of it. They were trying to rebuild the concept of the home game industry. Also, Nintendo required their games to be NES exclusive for 2 years before they could be ported to your Commodore 64s and televisions, ColecoVisions, Atari's own home consoles. It's a thing. When you're the market leader, you can demand these kind of things. Atari Games tried to negotiate for a less restrictive license to produce games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo refused, so Atari Games agreed to Nintendo's standard licensing terms. Under the Tengen banner, 3 officially licensed games were released: RBI Baseball, Pac-Man, and Gauntlet. However, Tengen was not satisfied. Tengen insisted they still get what they wanted. So, they got sneaky. Super Schnicker. You see, one of the ways Nintendo's prevented unlicensed games, theoretically, from being released on the Nintendo Entertainment System is they had a lockout chip known as the 10NES chip. Basically, what it did is it checked the software on the cartridge for certain coding that Nintendo put in the games, in the cartridges when they manufactured them. See, goes back to what we said. Nintendo had to manufacture the cartridges for the other companies. And thus, if you didn't have that little security check verification, theoretically the game wouldn't run. The classic override to this is that manufacturers would have the cartridge trigger a voltage spike, thus shorting out the 10NES chip so it thinks the cartridge passed the security verification and that it was a licensed cartridge. Tengen knew, though, that when you deal with voltage spikes, you risk causing damage to the NES motherboard itself, which would, of course, KO your console and tick off your consumers. Nobody wins when that happens. Not to mention making it much more obvious that, y'all were doing something you're not supposed to be doing. So, they started development on a chip they called Rabbit, thinking that they could have a chip that would outsmart the chip without doing any kind of damaging voltage spiking. Unfortunately, Nintendo expected this to happen because, you don't build a security system without assuming somebody's going to try to exploit any flaws it may or may not have. Of course it's going to have flaws. Everything has flaws. If you admit that thing has flaws, and you know what the flaws are, you can prepare for them. Granted, it's ultimately an arms race when you do this, but the only other choice you have is to let people just override your chip willy-nilly. So, Tengen's only choice was to reverse engineer the 10NES chip and decipher the code in a manner where no matter what minor modifications were made, they could still bypass the 10NES security chip because they knew the base programming on the chip, which you really couldn't alter without essentially rebuilding it from scratch, which Nintendo wasn't going to do, because that's expensive. Here's where things get fun, though. The engineers were unable to do so because it was a very well-built chip. They were running into a deadline where all these unlicensed games needed to hit the market soon, and they were going to have to work in the NES. And yes, I said all these unlicensed games. They had a whole selection of them ready to go. Tengen went all in on this gamble. Greed. Maybe a little bit of bitterness, but a lot of greed. So what do we do? Can't reverse engineer the chip. We need to know how the chip works on its most basic level. There's got to be a way to get access to that information. Nintendo won't give it to us because they'll know we're up to something. We need somebody that has documentation on the chip that is not Nintendo. A chip created by the company to be used exclusively for the company in America. Unique technology. Why, that's something that has to be legally patented. Which means you have to have documentation with the U.S. Patent Office, because that's how patents work. You apply for a patent, the U.S. Patent Office grants it, they keep a copy of the paperwork for their own internal use. Because, of course, that's how things work. You have to have your own copy of the paperwork. But the United States Copyright Office, they're not just going to give this information out. It's their information. It belongs to them and Nintendo. So Tengen's lawyers contacted the government office and requested a copy of the Nintendo lockout program, claiming the company needed it for litigation against Nintendo. Because that is the only time the U.S. Copyright Office would give this information out, if you needed it for legal purposes. After all, that is one of the ways the U.S. court system works, and it is a very good system. If you're suing somebody because you claim they're doing unfair business practices, in order to prove it, you have to have the information. Verified information that they cannot defend against by saying, that's not true. So in order to have a fair trial, where all the pertinent information is available to both parties, so everybody knows what's going to be discussed, and nobody has secret knowledge that would give them an unfair advantage, the U.S. Copyright Office would give you information. Problem is, you have to actually be going through the litigation process to do this. Tengen was not. They simply told the U.S. Copyright Office, hey, we're getting ready to sue. We need this information for the lawsuit. Remember that very carefully. So Tengen got access to the information they needed to reverse engineer the 10NES chip. It then used the program to create its own chip that would unlock the NES, so they could print as many games as they wanted, unlicensed, that would function on the Nintendo Entertainment System console. Tengen announced they were going to release their own cartridges in December of 1988. Now this is important to remember because Tengen was incorporated on December 21st of 1987. Within a year, they rolled out their unlicensed games. Remember that. Within 12 months, they went through the process, tried everything they could think of, got the information from the Copyright Office, released the games. And remember, the whole reason they panicked and went to the Copyright Office to release these unlicensed games was because they had already decided they were going to do it. That is a small window in the business world, especially when you're talking about technology. This is very firm evidence that Tengen, from the second they made the deal with Nintendo to honor Nintendo's standard licensing agreement, knew they were going to go behind Nintendo's back. They signed it, holding a knife in the other hand, ready to stab Nintendo. Malicious intent. That is a term you will hear in courts. When Tengen launched the unlicensed versions of its games, Nintendo immediately sued Tengen for copyright and patent infringement. Because, after all, you cannot release these games, have them work this smoothly, unless you knew what was going on with the Tengen chip on a level you couldn't know if you were respecting copyrights and patents. As soon as those unlicensed games came out and worked smoothly, Nintendo knew. It wasn't... Tengen didn't even try to hide it. This began a series of lawsuits between the companies which would not be settled until 1994. However, in the meantime, Tengen faced another court challenge with Nintendo in 1989 in copyright controversy over the two companies' NES versions of Tetris. Tengen lost this suit and was forced to recall what was estimated to be hundreds and thousands of unsold cartridges of its versions of Tetris, having only sold about 50,000 copies. What this also means is if you have a copy of the Tengen Tetris in working condition, you have a valuable game. In fact, any of the unlicensed Tengen games are valuable. Tetris especially so because it was the core of its own separate lawsuit. So, we did mention the other series of lawsuits, and that is what this is about. The core of the lawsuits, back and forth, over and over again, centered on that copyright patent infringement. Because when Tengen released the games, and Nintendo realized the only reason they're working this smoothly and not damaging the hardware with voltage spiking is if they were able to reverse engineer the chips, which shouldn't have been possible unless you had access to copyrighted information that Tengen should not have had access to, let alone use it in that manner. Nintendo, all they had to do was have their lawyers go, "Hey, U.S. Copyright Office, did Tengen get information from you about the Tengen chip?" "Oh, they did. Because they were preparing litigation against us." "No, they weren't." "Yeah. Yes. Tengen lied to a federal government office Wicked devil horns. Wicked devil horns. In order to violate federal copyright laws. So you're busted for violating the federal copyright law. You're busted for lying to the federal government. You ain't got a defense that's going to hold up in any court in the nation, even in civil court. I mean, yes, the government's going to fine the sin out of you for lying to the Copyright Office and doing so with malicious intent. So you could violate their federal copyright laws. Like the federal government or not, you have to give them credit. Like all of us, they don't like being lied and manipulated to. You can't blame them. Fair business practices. Every business has a right to copyright technology that they create and protect that information from people who want to use it to take money that they did not earn. Which is what Tengen was doing. So, Tengen's only real defense was to go back to the license restricting and claim that it was so intense and so out of line that Nintendo was trying to set a standard where these individual companies making games for the NES console could not produce enough product and in enough quantities and keep enough of the profit margin that they could afford to make enough money to do anything but, pardon the phrase, but this is pretty much it, slave away under the yoke of Nintendo. That was their defense. Nintendo was being unfair and cruel. Unfortunately, it worked for 5 years. It worked for 5 years, but eventually the court system looked at Tengen and went, no, this licensing agreement, as Nintendo admits, is based upon things that harmed the industry in previous years that other companies did. They're trying to prevent a flooding of the market of inferior product and overinvesting in product production by companies so everybody can stay in business. And y'all lied to the federal government. Because you agreed to that deal knowing you were going to go behind Nintendo's back and dishonor the deal. You were very naughty, Tengen. Very naughty. Now, Tengen would go on to produce games for other systems, including the Sega Genesis, Master System, Game Gear, and TurboGrafx 16, as well as publish localized Sega CD titles. The company also licensed games for home computers, such as the Amiga and the Atari ST, most of which were published by British company Domark. It's best known for its ports of popular Atari arcade games, because that goes back to the beginning. Tengen was a subsidiary of Atari Games, which ran the arcade division. So, obviously, a priority of theirs would be porting the arcade games, such as Clax, Hard Drivin', Stunt Runner, and Paperboy. Although they did publish many other titles as well, like the aforementioned RBI Baseball, Pac-Man, and Gauntlet, the only licensed games. In 1994, the lawsuit against Nintendo settled, and after Time Warner reacquired a controlling stake in Atari Games, go back to our previous blog about the many different ways that the company that started as just simple little Atari was split, renamed, bought out, sold off, renamed, split, It's a whole video. It gets really branchy and convoluted. I can't really summarize it short, but here's the basics you got to know. Tengen was losing money left and right to Nintendo lawsuits and having to pull product off the market as a result of the lawsuits. Time Warner scooped in and bought them out. Tengen was consolidated into Time Warner Interactive and ceased existing as its own separate company, and you gotta believe a lot of those executives that made those decisions knowing that sooner or later they were going to get some kind of legal trouble over it, were not invited to have high-paying executive positions in Time Warner Interactive. In 2024, homebrew developer Jeff Silvers acquired the Tengen trademark to launch a new company called Tengen Games. The company's first game was Z&Z, an 8-bit arcade-style action platformer. So, we're going to close this out with a quick rundown list of the various unlicensed games that Tengen put out on the NES. Tetris, the Soviet mind game. The one that got its own separate lawsuit because, dude, that's how big Tetris is as a game. It is an icon of the industry. Super Sprint. Rolling Thunder, Roadrunner, Vindicators, Afterburner. Not released to the version released by Sunsoft in Japan, which was titled Afterburner 2. Alien Syndrome, Shinobi, Tubin, Fantasy Zone, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. A licensed version was published later by Mindscape. Klax, Ms. Pac-Man, unrelated to Namco's 1993 port, Pac-Mania, RBI Baseball 2, RBI Baseball 3, and Skull and Crossbones. That is, let's count them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 unlicensed games released for the NES compared to the 3 licensed games. They actually had the ability to do 5 licensed games under the Nintendo deal, and instead of hitting all 5 and only releasing 12 unlicensed, well, no, because 17 of 3, so they would have gotten it down to like 15 unlicensed versus 5. They just went whole hog into it. Like, they basically just released those 3 licensed games just to throw Nintendo off the scent. I mean, bro. Seriously? And again, that was only 5 licensed games a year. You could have just held back on the unlicensed games and released them over the next 3 to 4 years. And everybody would have been happy. Nobody would have gotten sued. But Tengen had to make a point. Tengen had to refuse to play along and follow a model that a lot of other software publishers were dealing with. They might not have always been happy with the NES deals and restrictions, but they did it. They made money. They held out. And as we went into the Super Nintendo era, the restrictions loosened. They could have done plenty of business with Sega. Some of them hung around long enough to start doing business with PlayStation and Xbox. But Tengen had to play the FAFO game. Around and find out. Like, I want to understand. I had some Tengen games. We owned the officially licensed RBI Baseball. I played copies of the unlicensed Tetris. and tubing. You know? Probably a couple of the others if I really think about it. You know, everybody had an NES. You'd go to your friend's house and play different copies, borrow their copies. We all recognize the Tengen discs. Unlike the classic gray NES, these were black, had a little slant in the front, gold trim. You instantly knew a Tengen game when it sat in the collection. It stuck out. That's the other thing. They were able to design cartridges that stood out in a collection that made people go, oh, dude, what's that? Oh, that's one of those Tengen games. Man, they're so cool. They get to have cartridges, you know, have their own shape and color to them. I know. There were certain NES officially licensed NES games. They came in different colors. We all know about the Gold Zelda cartridges. The point still remained, though. If you had a Tengen game stuck among your NES ones, sitting in your, you know, your drawer, your shelf, that thing stuck out. It drew the eye. Good marketing. But it was good marketing hurt by stupidity. So in the end, here's what we're going to say to you folks. Tengen. We get it. You know, you suffered because of the Atari split-offs and restructurings, and you have these rights, you have these rights. But dudes, you made some stupid mistakes. And I don't feel sorry for you. As I said, fool around and find out. Still, it's all good times because, hey, video games are fun. We appreciate the entertainment that they give us. And we're going to talk about another video game company. Maybe not next time. Maybe in a couple episodes. I like to spread things around, so that people that aren't video game super fans don't have to wait a long time to get content of a different sort. We have content. I create content. But I do not call myself a content creator. I am a rambler. Because it's the Friday Ramblings. And with that, I'm going to tell you, as always, subscribe, comment, hit your like buttons, tell the algorithm to tell everybody we're here. And we're going to keep things mellow. And until I see you again, stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe.